Padre Pio's guardian angel abandoned him that night, not by choice but by force. The writings exist, the testimony remains, one attack so vicious, so cosmically violent, that even his celestial protector could not intervene. This is not mythology. This is documented spiritual warfare. The day heaven withdrew, the moment a saint stood alone against something unstoppable, and the single weapon that finally ended it. The guardian angel had been there since childhood, a presence Padre Pio described with the intimacy of a brother, the constancy of breath itself. Throughout decades of mystical torment and demonic assault, this celestial being had stood between the priest and the abyss, deflecting attacks that would have shattered lesser souls into madness. The writings document hundreds of encounters, nights when shadows took physical form and clawed at his flesh, mornings when he would wake covered in wounds that had no earthly origin. Yet always, the angel intervened. Always, there was a barrier between Pio and total annihilation. Until the night when that barrier simply vanished, when the presence he had known for over 50 years withdrew into an inexplicable silence, leaving him to face something that heaven itself seemed unwilling to confront directly. The date remains preserved in his personal correspondence, a single entry that stands apart from all others in its raw terror and theological confusion. Padre Pio did not write with dramatics or exaggeration. His journals read like medical reports from a war zone, clinical descriptions of supernatural violence delivered in the measured language of someone documenting phenomena for future investigation. But this entry fractures that composure. The handwriting itself changes, becoming jagged and desperate, the ink smudged in places as though written by trembling hands. He describes calling out to his guardian angel as the presence in his cell intensified, as the air itself seemed to curdle with malevolence, so concentrated it became almost visible. He called out again and again, using the private names and invocations that had always summoned immediate response. But for the first time in his conscious memory, there was only silence. The angel did not come, could not come. And Pio understood with a clarity that bordered on revelation that whatever had entered his space that night operated on a level of spiritual authority that even his protector could not challenge. The attack began with sound, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate not from any direction, but from existence itself, as though reality was being played backwards at a pitch just below human hearing. Pio's writings describe it as the sound of uncreation, the noise that matter might make if it were being slowly unmade at the molecular level. Objects in his cell began to resonate with this frequency, the wooden crucifix on the wall starting to rattle against the stone, the metal bed frame humming with a tone that set his teeth on edge. Then came the cold, but not the absence of heat, something far more profound. This was the cold of negation, the temperature of spaces where warmth had never existed and never could. It moved through the room in waves, each one more intense than the last, until Pio could see his breath crystallizing in the air despite the summer heat beyond his walls. He reached for his rosary, the beads worn smooth from decades of prayer, and found them covered in a layer of frost that burned his fingers like acid. The entity made itself known gradually, as though it wanted him to fully comprehend what was approaching before the final confrontation. Shadows detached from corners where no shadows should exist, pooling on the floor like liquid, before rising into shapes that suggested human form but violated every natural proportion. Arms too long, joints bending in directions that defied anatomy, faces that were almost recognizable but fundamentally wrong in ways that triggered primal revulsion. Pio had encountered demons before, had wrestled with manifested evil in forms both subtle and grotesque. But those encounters always carried a certain theatricality, a sense that the entities were testing boundaries, probing for weakness. This was different. These shadows moved with purpose and patience, not as attackers seeking an opening, but as executioners following a predetermined script. They surrounded his bed in a perfect circle, maintaining exact distances from each other, and simply waited. The message was clear. There would be no interruption, no rescue, no divine intervention. This was a sanctioned engagement, a spiritual trial that he was meant to face alone. When the central presence finally manifested, it did so without fanfare or dramatic revelation. simply existing suddenly where nothing had been moments before. Pio describes it as a figure cloaked in something that resembled cloth, but moved with its own volition, fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the shape of a man. The face beneath the hood was visible only in fragments, a suggestion of features that shifted too rapidly to focus on, eyes that were sometimes human and sometimes vast and empty, as interstellar space. It spoke, though not with sound, but with direct insertion of meaning into Pio's consciousness, bypassing language entirely to communicate in raw concepts and images. The message was simple and devastating. He had been chosen for this encounter specifically because his guardian angel's protection had been temporarily suspended by divine decree. This was a test of a different order, a confrontation that required him to face absolute spiritual isolation and emerge either broken or transformed. There would be no assistance, no miraculous deliverance. Only his will, his faith, and whatever weapons he could summon from the deepest reserves of his soul. The physical assault began immediately after this revelation, and it carried a precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of human vulnerability. The entity did not simply attack his body, but targeted specific nerve clusters, pressure points in his spiritual anatomy that corresponded to states of existential dread. Pio felt his certainties dissolving, the bedrock convictions that had sustained him through decades of mystical trial suddenly seeming fragile as paper. Doubts he had never entertained now bloomed with horrifying vitality. What if everything he believed was elaborate self-deception? What if his visions and stigmata were symptoms of pathology rather than grace? What if God was not absent, but simply non-existent? The demon worked these wounds with surgical skill, not trying to convince him of apostasy, but simply exposing the hairline fractures that exist in even the strongest faith, then applying pressure until those fractures widened into chasms. Pio's writings describe it as being flayed from the inside out, every layer of protective certainty stripped away until he stood naked before the possibility of absolute meaninglessness. And through it all, he continued to call for his guardian angel, knowing the call would not be answered, needing to voice it anyway as the last remaining gesture of the faith that was being systematically dismantled. In previous encounters, the rosary had been his fortress, each bead a stone in an impregnable wall between himself and darkness. Pio had witnessed demons recoil from the mere sight of it, had seen malevolent presences dissolve like smoke when he began the familiar prayers. His hands moved now through the decades with mechanical precision, muscle memory taking over as his conscious mind struggled against the assault. But the words emerging from his lips sounded hollow, stripped of their usual power, as though he were reciting poetry in a language he had forgotten. The entity circling him did not flinch or retreat. Instead, it seemed to lean closer, studying his efforts with what might have been curiosity or contempt. When Pio reached the final mystery and prepared to begin again, the rosary suddenly grew hot in his grip, the beads burning with such intensity that his palms began to blister. Not from demonic interference, the sensation was different, more like a rejection, as though the sacred object itself was recoiling from his touch, declaring him somehow unworthy or insufficient for the protection it normally provided. Holy water had always been immediate and absolute in its effect, a substance that demons could not endure even in microscopic amounts. Pio kept a small font by his bedside, blessed by 3 bishops and containing water from Lourdes itself. His fingers found the container in the darkness, trembling as he unscrewed the cap and splashed the contents toward the central figure. The water arced through the air in a silver stream, droplets catching what little light remained in the cell. But instead of the expected reaction, hissing, retreat, cries of anguish, there was only silence. The water passed through the entity as though through empty air, striking the wall behind and running down the stone in ordinary rivulets. Worse still, when Pio looked at his hand, the moisture remaining on his skin had changed, no longer feeling blessed or consecrated but simply neutral, robbed of whatever spiritual charge it once carried. The entity leaned down, its non-face hovering inches from his own, and in that moment, Pio understood a terrible truth. He was not being attacked by something unholy, so much as being tested by something operating under divine permission, and therefore his usual defenses were not failing. They were being deliberately neutralized to ensure the test remained pure. The crucifix above his bed had been his last line of defense in countless nocturnal battles, the physical representation of sacrifice and redemption that no demon could approach without agony. Pio fixed his eyes on it now, forcing his vision to focus through the disorientation and fear, commanding his mind to meditate on the suffering it represented and draw strength from that contemplation. But as he stared, the figure on the cross seemed to blur and shift, the familiar features of agony becoming something alien and wrong. The face turned toward him. Impossible. He knew it was carved wood. But it turned nonetheless, and the expression he saw there was not compassion or shared suffering, but something approaching disappointment, even judgment. His prayers for intercession through Christ's sacrifice fell flat, bouncing back at him like sound waves striking a wall. The entity behind him made a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been wind passing through a hollow space, and when Pio looked again at the crucifix, he saw that it was now facing away from him, the carved back of Christ's head visible where the face should be, as though even this representation of divine love had chosen to avert its gaze from what was happening in this cell tonight. Latin prayers, the ancient formulas that had been refined through centuries of exorcism and spiritual combat, poured from his lips in desperate succession. The rituals of banishment, the commands in the name of the Trinity, the invocations of saints and archangels who had cast demons into the pit. Pio's training was extensive and precise. He knew the exact words, the proper inflections, the ritual gestures that accompanied each sacred formula. But as he spoke, he became aware that the words were not reaching their intended destination, as though he were shouting into a void that absorbed all sound without echo or response. The entity did not resist these prayers, because it did not need to. They were simply irrelevant to the current situation. Spells of protection and banishment being spoken in a context where protection had been withdrawn, and banishment was not the purpose. The demon was here by appointment, not by transgression, and all the formulaic weapons in Pio's considerable arsenal were useless against something that had permission to be exactly where it was, doing exactly what it was doing. The stigmata wounds in his hands and feet began to bleed more heavily than they had in years, the blood flowing so freely it soaked through his habit and pooled on the floor around his bed. In previous attacks, these wounds had been sources of spiritual power, physical manifestations of his connection to Christ's suffering, and therefore conduits for divine protection. Other demons had been unable to approach him when the stigmata were active, as though the bleeding itself created a barrier they could not cross. But now the entity moved closer, reaching out with elongated fingers to touch the blood, and Pio felt a nauseating inversion of meaning. The blood that should have been his shield was being used as a medium of access, the wounds that marked his holiness becoming entry points for something that wanted to inhabit or corrupt that holiness from within. The demon traced symbols in the pooled blood, patterns that Pio's mind refused to fully process, geometries that suggested impossible dimensions and relationships. When he tried to pray through the pain, to offer his suffering as he had been taught, he found that even this most fundamental weapon had been turned against him, his own sanctified wounds becoming tools in his tormentor's hands. Fasting had always sharpened his spiritual senses, weakening the body to strengthen the soul's connection to the divine. Pio had gone without food for days at a time when particularly dangerous spiritual work was required, and his emaciated frame bore witness to decades of mortification. But tonight, his hunger felt different, not purifying but simply depleting, leaving him weak and vulnerable rather than focused and powerful. The entity seemed to feed on this weakness, growing more substantial and defined as Pio's physical resources dwindled. He realized with sick certainty that all his preparations, all the standard protocols of spiritual warfare, had been counterproductive in this instance. He had armed himself with weapons that required divine backing to function, and that backing had been deliberately removed. He was a soldier who had trained exclusively with firearms, suddenly finding himself in battle with no ammunition. Every reflex and strategy suddenly worse than useless. The demon was teaching him something through this systematic failure, demonstrating with cruel precision that his power had never been his own, that every victory he had achieved was only possible through grace that could be withdrawn as easily as it was given, leaving him as helpless as any ordinary man facing the incomprehensible darkness. The moment of absolute abandonment arrived, not with drama but with stillness, a sudden cessation of struggle that felt like drowning must feel in its final stage, when the body stops fighting and begins to accept the water filling its lungs. Pio lay on his bed, every defense shattered, every weapon proven impotent, and simply stopped resisting. Not from despair exactly, though despair was certainly present in the cocktail of emotions flooding his consciousness. Rather, he stopped because there was nothing left to do, no further strategies to attempt, no reserves of strength to draw upon. The demon loomed above him, no longer bothering with the pretense of distance or stalking, close enough now that Pio could feel the cold radiating from it, like heat from a furnace in reverse. And in that moment of total surrender, when his mind finally ceased its frantic searching for solutions and his will released its death grip on control, a thought arrived with such simplicity and clarity that it cut through the chaos like light through fog. He had been fighting to save himself, to defend his own spiritual territory, to preserve his own sanctity. But what if the weapon that could end this was not about him at all? The prayer that formed on his lips was not one of protection or banishment, not a formula or ritual designed to achieve a specific spiritual outcome. It was barely even a prayer in the traditional sense, more an acknowledgement of fact, a statement of reality spoken into the darkness, without any expectation of result. He prayed for the demon itself, not against it, but for it, addressing his words not to God as mediator, but directly to this entity of malice and corruption. The words were clumsy, unpracticed, because no one had ever taught him this approach. No manual of spiritual warfare included a chapter on interceding for the attacker during the attack. He prayed for whatever fragment of the divine remained in this creature, for the angelic being it must have been before the fall, for the suffering it must experience existing in eternal opposition to its own created nature. He prayed that it might somehow find peace, though he had no idea what peace could mean for something so fundamentally broken. He prayed that its existence might serve some purpose in the grand architecture of creation that he could not comprehend, that even this horror might be woven into patterns of meaning beyond his understanding. The words trembled with uncertainty and fear, but they were genuine, emerging not from strategy or technique, but from a place deeper than his terror, a bedrock of compassion that even systematic torture had not managed to erode. The change in atmosphere was immediate and disorienting, like a pressure differential being suddenly equalized. The demon recoiled, not as it might from holy water or crucifix, but in what appeared to be confusion, its shadowy form losing coherence around the edges, as though the physics holding it together had been disrupted. The cold began to recede, and with it the sense of suffocating malevolence that had saturated the air. Pio continued praying, finding his rhythm now, each word building on the last not as attack or defense but as genuine intercession, asking mercy for something that had shown him none, requesting grace for a being that existed as grace's antithesis. It made no logical sense, violated every principle of spiritual combat he had been taught, but he felt truth in it, a rightness that resonated in his bones. The entity's response was not verbal, but Pio perceived it nonetheless, a quality of shock, even outrage, at being addressed this way. It had come prepared for resistance, for fear, for hatred, for desperate attempts at banishment. It had no protocol for being prayed for, no defense against sincere compassion directed at its own suffering rather than the suffering it inflicted. Light began to filter back into the cell, not from any physical source, but as though the darkness itself was losing its grip on the space, unable to maintain its density in the presence of this strange new spiritual configuration. Pio felt his guardian angel return with a rush of warmth and familiar presence, not as though it had abandoned him and was now returning, but as though a barrier had been lifted, allowing it to re-enter space from which it had been temporarily barred. The angel did not speak or explain, but Pio understood through direct knowing rather than words. This had been necessary. This isolation and terror had been carefully orchestrated not as punishment, but as education. He had needed to discover the weapon himself, because it only worked if freely chosen, if genuinely meant. Compassion as spiritual warfare could not be taught or commanded or ritualized. It had to emerge organically, from a soul stripped of all other options, a final act of will, when the will itself had been beaten into submission. The demon began to fade, not defeated exactly, but released, as though Pio's prayers had temporarily lightened whatever burden kept it bound to malice, giving it a moment's respite from its own nature before the eternal patterns reasserted themselves, and it was drawn back into its assigned role in the cosmic drama. The aftermath was not triumph, but exhaustion so profound it felt like a second kind of death. Pio lay in his bed as dawn light began to creep through his window, his body covered in sweat and blood, his mind struggling to process what had happened and extract meaning from the terror. The guardian angel remained close now, its presence a comfort, but also a reminder of how absolute his isolation had been when it was absent. His hands found his journal, the pen feeling impossibly heavy as he forced himself to document the encounter, while details remained fresh. The entry he wrote that morning would become one of the most analyzed texts in mystical literature. Scholars and theologians returning to it again and again, trying to understand the mechanism of what he had discovered. But even in his exhaustion, Pio knew that analysis would never fully capture it, that the weapon he had found was too paradoxical, too contrary to human instinct to be systematized or reliably replicated. It worked because it should not work, because it violated the fundamental logic of combat by refusing to recognize the distinction between self and enemy, extending the same desire for grace to both parties in the conflict until that distinction dissolved. In subsequent years, Pio would refer to that night rarely and always, with visible discomfort, as though the memory retained power to disturb him even decades later. When pressed by other priests or spiritual directors who heard rumors of the encounter and wanted details, he would emphasize the lesson rather than the horror, that divine protection is always conditional, always subject to withdrawal for purposes humans cannot anticipate or understand, and that the deepest weapons of spiritual warfare are not techniques of defense, but qualities of character that must be cultivated in peacetime and discovered in crisis. He began teaching that compassion extended even to demons was not weakness or confusion, but perhaps the only response that transcended the eternal cycle of attack and defense, the only force that could temporarily disrupt the machinery of spiritual violence by refusing to participate in its fundamental logic. Most found this teaching incomprehensible or even dangerous, worried that it encouraged passivity in the face of evil. But those who had glimpsed real darkness, who understood how insufficient even the strongest defenses could be against certain orders of malevolence, recognized the wisdom in what he was describing. Not a universal strategy, but a final option, the weapon of absolute last resort, when heaven itself has stepped back and declared that all other weapons are forbidden, leaving only the impossible gift of mercy for one's destroyer as the single tool that might break the pattern and allow light to return to spaces where darkness had been granted temporary dominion over everything a human soul believed was sacred and inviolable.